Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Olaiya, and I'm a bioinformatics software engineer in the Mayan Lab. And today I will be talking about using APIs in bioinformatic workflows. So as an overview, today we will cover what an API is and the popular types of API protocols, paying particular focus to REST and GraphQL APIs. I will then go through how to use API documentations to make API requests for bioinformatic tools, and also to inspect the network activity in the browser to understand what API calls are being made by an application. Finally, I will cover how to make API requests programmatically by utilizing the API documentations, and also how to use these bioinformatic APIs to create workflows. Firstly, what is an API? An application programming interface, or API for short, is the part of a server that provides an interface for two or more applications to communicate with one another. APIs enable extracting and sharing data across applications through a set of protocols and definitions. And I'll cover more of the commonly used protocols in a little bit. Many of the applications that we use on a day-to-day basis make use of APIs to perform certain functions. So, for example, let's consider an app that requires weather data to function. In the case that the application is not producing this data by themselves, in order to get this information, they can make a request to a server that serves this daily weather data. And then they can use this and integrate that into their application that way. To understand how APIs work and how they can be used, there are some key terms to cover. And so when using an API, a client is the application that is using the API. That is the application that is sending the API request. A resource is the piece of data that the API can provide to this client. So looking at the example that I gave earlier, this could be this could be the daily weather data. The resource can also be images or text or some kind of information that is stored in a database. A server, on the other hand, is an application that receives a request and sends back a response, which may sometimes contain a resource. And so the diagram here shows the kind of like the basic workflow of API requests and responses and how they go between the client and the server. There are four popular types of API protocols that are currently used. So we have the representational state transfer, or REST, GraphQL, SOAP, and RPC API protocols. I will cover the more commonly used REST and GraphQL API protocols in this lecture, and just briefly go over what SOAP and RPCs are. So in the representational state transfer, or REST APIs, are APIs that use hypertext transfer protocol, or HTTP requests, to access and use data using CRUD operations. CRUD being create, read, update, and delete. GraphQL, on the other hand, is a query language, and this is used to retrieve data from multiple sources over a single API endpoint by describing the exact data requirements of the output that we want to get from this API call. And this is different to REST, because in REST, if we're trying to get information from different sources, so for example, trying to get both user data and GSAN data, we'd have to send separate API requests to make this call. But in GraphQL, we can structure our query such that we're able to get this over a single API endpoint. SOAP, or a SOAP API, is SOAP, or SOAP API, which stands for Simple Object Access Protocol, is our standard messaging protocol where the client and the server exchange messages using extensible markup language, or XML. And SOAP has very strictly defined rules and advanced security, which makes it one of the best API protocols for systems that are handling sensitive data, such as financial services and online banking applications. In remote procedure calls or RPC APIs, the client makes a remote function call to the server, and then this function is then executed server side. And so here the client is using an HTTP post request to call a specific function by name, and then this function is then executed on the server. This is a little different to REST and GraphQL and SOAP in the sense that we're not limited to only doing CRUD operations. And so here, the client-side developers, knowing the function name and the parameters, they're able to send this to the server so that this function is performed remotely on that server. There are two types of RPCs. So we have the JSON RPC, which uses the JSON message format to encode the data that we use to create the procedure call. So the function name and the parameters are encoded in the JSON format here. While we have the XML RPC, which uses like similarly to JSON, except that this uses the XML format in order to encode the data that we're using to create these remote procedure calls.